Yeah, so I'm gonna make a co-host.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to start this presentation again. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm just gonna begin speaking a little bit about our agency, which is Adapt Community Network. And this presentation is about Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Funds. And just a little bit our presenters. Myself, Michelle Jimenez Alvarez, I'm one of the housing advocates for our housing assistance program in our agency, Adopt Community Network. We specialize on helping families in New York City with a household member who has OPWDD eligibility and who are facing housing challenges, providing education, information, and connecting them to resources. We also have two of our presenters today, which is Cass Schizner and Noah Nipkins. They will tell you a little bit more about themselves when they do their presentation. So, like I said at the beginning, this is DAP Community Network. Is a housing. I'm sorry, we're a human nonprofit providing cutting edge programs and services for people with disabilities. This is our mission. Every day, we build a more exclusive world for thousands of New Yorkers through education, technology, health, residential, and recreational programs in all the five boroughs. Our mission is to empower people through initiative solutions, one person at a time. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about our housing assistance services. This is one of the services we provide in our agency. So your home is your safe place. Adopt Community Network provides housing assistance services. The program helps families with a household member with an intellectual disability and or developmental disability navigate the New York City's fast housing system. HAS offers advocacy support, information, referrals for families seeking assistance with housing concerns. How do you get started if you are interested in this service? Whoever's eligible for OPWDD um, and has a member in the household that has eligibility and lives in within the five boroughs of New York City. If you need more information for OPWDD, uh, I want, like I said in the beginning, I will put the Project Connect information line on the chat and you can call us and we can give you more information. So how do you get started to get housing services? You complete and submit a HAS application and a life plan, a request. So then we request to open a case and we submit it to the Development Disability Regional Office, which is the DDRO by HAS. And DDRO sends us an approval email to our housing assistance services and housing advocate is assigned to the family. Or program services. We have housing advocates. Each family has an assigned housing advocate who works with the family to meet their housing needs. Housing advocates provide information, advocacy resources, and act as a liaison to outside agencies. Housing webinars. We offer free webinars covering a multitude of housing related topics offered to the public on a quarterly basis. We have a housing letter, a housing free newsletter featuring articles discussing housing resources and featuring a HAS family story. We have bilingual staff. We have Spanish speaking staff available and use language line for additional translation services. Some of the common concerns that our families have when they come to our program is low income and affordably or accessible housing, finding apartments for low income, rent arrears, eviction process and housing court, break-ins, leaks, housing hazard conditions, landlord harassment, rental assistance, and tenants' rights. So thank you for joining us. Now this is the slide where we have the presentation for, where we have the information for Project Connect. If you wanna take a screenshot or write the information, you're welcome to. I'm also gonna share with you that we are on the social media and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, on YouTube. And like I said, I'm gonna put the information on the website. And now I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna pass to Cass, who is gonna be doing the rest of the presentation. Go ahead, Cass.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Excellent. I should be sharing my screen now unless I am somehow showing the Zoom
Yes, you
room
can.
by
Yeah,
accident. It's all
we
perfect?
can see it. We can see it, yes.
Excellent. Okay. Noah, can you see the screen as well?
Yep, I can see it. All good.
Perfect. So before we begin, I'll introduce myself, and then I will give my colleague time to introduce herself. My name is Cass Fisherer. I am the Disability Justice and Accessibility Legal Fellow with the Fair Housing Justice Center. I assist with our Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Fund, and I help with some legal navigation in the office regarding disability rights and the Fair Housing Act and fair housing laws in New York City. This presentation is not legal advice. We cannot offer you legal advice. Full disclosure, I am an attorney. I am licensed in New Jersey, but this presentation is not me and Noah providing you with legal advice. It's a Know Your Rights training and a quick and helpful exploration of the fund that we provide to individuals who need modifications to their homes.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Noah. I am a staff member at the Fair Housing Justice Center. I help with different programs and our outreach efforts. So giving presentations like this, doing tabling, running our social media, that kind of stuff. I also do research for our policy and legal and investigations teams. And we're excited to be speaking with you today.
Excellent. So our first slide, additionally, also I realized I forgot to give myself an image description. I am a white mask presenting individual with a short haircut wearing a multicolored jewel tone sweater and a pair of Bose headphones.
I can give one too. I'm a white woman, I have brown hair, and I'm wearing a black and gray striped shirt.
Excellent. So our presentation, our first slide says the Fair Housing Justice Center, disability discrimination, reasonable modifications, reasonable accommodations, and the Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Fund. We have a small graphic with 3 individuals, one who is a wheelchair user, one with an invisible disability, and one who is using a white cane, walking towards a blue house.
Okay, so this next slide is all about what we do and our work. So the Fair Housing Justice Center's mission is 3-pronged. The first piece of that is to eliminate housing discrimination. So our service area is New York City and the surrounding counties. And so we work in those areas to eliminate housing discrimination. We also seek to promote policies and programs that foster open, accessible, and inclusive communities. And then the third piece of that mission is the 7 surrounding suburban counties. So that includes Dutchess, Nassau, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Suffolk, and Westchester. So as you can imagine, this is a pretty populous area. So we serve over about roughly 65% of New York State's population, which also amounts to about 3% of the United States population.
So Our programs include intake, counseling, testing, and legal referrals for housing discrimination complaints. We have the Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Fund, which we will go into near the end of the presentation. We do proactive investigations to document and eliminate systemic housing discrimination. We do fair housing advocacy and policy issues. We do education outreach activities like this presentation, and we do technical assistance and training. So we educate on know your rights for civilians, and we also will we sometimes provide trainings to housing providers as well, so that they can uphold the law as they are required to do so.
Okay, so just to get into some housing discrimination basics, something that we want to highlight for you all is that you cannot be discriminated against housing because of a protected characteristic. And we'll go into what that means in a second.
What are protected characteristics? So we have three fair housing laws that protect New York City residents. When I say New York City, because it's kind of like a silo where it's like over-encompasses. So you have the over-encompassing Federal Fair Housing Act, which covers race, religion, color, familial status, the presence of children, sex, which does include sexual orientation and gender identity, national origin, and disability. And then we have New York State human rights law. So you have the Federal Fair Housing Act as the main umbrella, and then you have New York State human rights law as a secondary umbrella, and that includes age, marital status, military status, lawful source of income, so that's voucher status, your employment, domestic violence, sex offense, stalking victim status, immigration, and citizenship status. And then on top of that, we have the third umbrella. If you're in New York City, you have New York City human rights law, which includes lawful occupation and domestic partnership status. So just to outline this, you have the Federal Fair Housing Act, which is like an overarching umbrella. And then if rain were to go through, we have the New York State human rights law, catches a little bit more rain, and then New York City human rights law catches even more rain. So if you're in New York City, you're protected by New York City human rights law, New York State human rights law, and the Federal Fair Housing Act. If you're outside of New York City, in New York State, you're under New York State human rights law and under the Federal Fair Housing Act. And then if you're outside of New York State, it's really dependent on your local Federal Fair Housing, your local fair housing laws, but the whole nation is under the Federal Fair Housing Act, which includes all of the protected characteristics that we reviewed.
Okay, so who cannot discriminate against you? The short answer is everyone involved in providing housing. So to get into some specifics, this could include, a landlord, your super, a management company, any kind of seller, a real estate agent, a bank, a co-op board, any kind of lender, an insurance company, an appraiser, or even your neighbors. So truly, in all aspects of renting, buying, or selling a home, you are protected from discrimination.
What counts as housing discrimination? Housing discrimination is differential treatment based off of a protected characteristic. Examples include lying to an individual about apartment availability, ghosting you. So that's oftentimes you send a text to a housing provider, you start a conversation, you share that you're a voucher holder, and then all of a sudden, randomly, you just stop hearing back. That is ghosting. Providing worse services to you, harassment, steering you to or from certain neighborhoods or a building or an area of a building, making any statement that indicates preference, limitation, or discrimination, refusing to allow reasonable accommodations, and refusing to allow reasonable modifications.
Okay, so the types of housing that are covered are most types of housing for rent or sale. Keyword most, so it's not actually all types of housing. But if you are in an apartment building, a condo, a co-op, any kind of like single room occupancy unit, if you're in supportive housing, in transitional housing, in public housing, like a mobile home park, a nursing home, an assisted living facility, or a retirement community, you are covered under these fair housing protections.
What's not covered? 3 situations. 1 or 2 family buildings where the owner lives, rooming houses not covered for sex discrimination only, certain age, or family-specific housing, not covered for familial status discrimination only. There are discounts for seniors 65 and older that are permitted.
Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about housing discrimination as it pertains to disability.
What are the fair housing rights of people with disabilities? Disabilities are protected characteristic under federal, state, and local fair housing laws. So you're protected from disability discrimination in all aspects of housing. You cannot be treated differently by landlords, sellers, agents, banks, management companies, operators of facilities, co-op boards, or other housing providers because of your disability. If you currently have a disability, you used to have a disability, or you are perceived to have a disability, you are protected and covered. The definition includes essentially like you may have had a disability at one point in your life, or you are assumed to have a disability, or you do have a disability. These are all protected under the Federal Fair Housing Act, federal, state, and local fair housing laws.
Okay, so how do we define disability? So, the definition of disability varies by legal jurisdiction. So the Federal Fair Housing Act defines disability as a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. But the definition is broader under New York state law. So this refers to a physical, mental, or medical impairment or a record of an impairment, which prevents the exercise of normal bodily function or is medically demonstrable. And then New York City law defines disability even more broadly as any physical, mental, medical, or psychological impairment, including a full range of sensory, mental, physical, mobility, developmental, learning, and psychological disabilities. So kind of like when Cass was talking about the different protections under federal, state, and local law, you know, depending on where you live, the definitions might vary. And if you live in New York City, you are, Cass, correct me if I'm wrong, covered under like the broadest sense of the definition of disability.
Yep, that's true. What are some examples of disability housing discrimination? So some examples include refusing to rent to an individual because they are an individual with a disability, steering individuals with disabilities towards certain properties or neighborhoods and away from others based on stereotypes or assumptions about their needs, rejecting a rental application because the landlord is uncomfortable renting to an individual with a disability or whose partner or family has a disability, isolating individuals with disabilities in specific units or areas within a housing complex, effectively segregating them from their other residents, requesting unnecessary medical information or documentation related to a disability during the application process, and refusing to make legally required reasonable modifications or accommodations.
Okay, so we're going to talk about what reasonable accommodations actually are and look like.
What are reasonable accommodations? If you're a person with a disability, you have the right to request that the rules or policies of the building where you live be altered to allow full use and enjoyment of your home. So when we go into modification, I'll define these separate, and you'll see, so a modification is a change to the physical dwelling, and accommodation is a change to policy. So here, definition, it means change to rules or policies so that you have full use and enjoyment. Individuals who can request a reasonable accommodation include yourself or an individual acting on your behalf, such as a family member. Any form of communication can be used. You can call your landlord, your housing provider, and say, hey, I need this accommodation. I need to pay rent later in the month due to a change in my disability benefits payment schedule. But we highly recommend that you do this communication in writing, or let's say, for instance, as I just gave, you call to then immediately send an email or any form of written documented communication that is dated that can be shown later on if there are issues. If anything arises, it's really helpful to have email communication or any written communication because you have a dated timestamped communication. So let's if you call and then you can just email afterwards and say, hey, fitting to our call that we just had, please remember that I asked for this accommodation and you said blank, 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 and I said blank, blank, blank. And you have that date stamped and documented, which can be helpful later on if there's any form of refusal.
Okay, so some examples of a reasonable accommodation. Cass already gave one, but to just give a few others, one example of a reasonable accommodation would be asking for a transfer to a first floor unit or a more accessible unit or community. It could be supplying a lease application in large print so that it's more accessible, providing an ASL interpreter at a tenant association meeting, assigning someone with a disability a reserved parking spot near the unit, even though tenant parking might generally be on a first come, first served basis. It could be making exceptions to the residency requirements to allow a home health aide to move into the apartment with a tenant. It could be allowing a person with a disability to keep an assistance animal despite a no pets policy. And then the final one is one that Cass already mentioned, but to reiterate, if you need adjustments to the rent payment schedule because you receive disability checks later in the month, that is another example of a reasonable accommodation.
Do I have to provide documentation or verification of my disability? If your disability is invisible, letters from a medical professional, social worker, or other professional may be requested by your housing provider. These letters can help explain how the accommodations are necessary based on your disability. Individuals who have visible disabilities, such as individuals who use wheelchairs or have a different mobility aids, it's sometimes easier to request an accommodation because your housing provider can visibly see that you're disabled. Personally, I always think it's important to have a medical letter regardless of invisible or visible disability, just because the more of a paper trail you have, the more communication and documentation you have, I think the stronger argument you can make for your accommodation. And it can just be, to me, overwhelmingly helpful. And also, a medical letter doesn't mean that your landlord can ask you, as shared during the application process, that your landlord cannot ask you for your entire medical history. A medical letter does not mean the entire documentation of your disability and experiences with your disability. It is usually a relatively short document from your medical provider, if you have one, which outlines your disability need as related to the accommodation you are requesting. So you do not and are not required and should not be required to send your entire medical history to your housing provider. That's your private information. If they're asking for more documentation, that can be problematic because they may be asking for too much of a verification process. There is a fine line that can be passed very easily.
Okay, so can I be charged an extra fee for providing my accommodation? No. Housing providers are not permitted to charge a fee for providing a reasonable accommodation. So an example of this, on the screen, there's a picture of an emotional support animal or an ESA. You could request a reasonable accommodation to have, a building's no pets policy kind of amended for you so that you can have your emotional support animal, but that does not mean that your housing provider can request a pet deposit or a pet fee for your assistance animal. So kind of as Cass was mentioning, there's this fine line between accepting the accommodation and making that request and charging a fee when you shouldn't be allowed to do that and you aren't allowed to do that.
Also, for this slide, I usually like to do just a quick blurb. The ADA does not cover emotional support animals, so you cannot take an emotional support animal onto an airplane, for instance, or into public areas, but the Fair Housing Act does cover emotional support animals. You're allowed to have an emotional support animal in your home as a reasonable accommodation. So if there's an anti-pet policy, you can have it. They cannot charge you for that accommodation, but you cannot take that same ESA and put that ESA onto an airplane, because the ADA and the Fair Housing Act are different laws that review emotional support animals differently. The ADA will look at and allow service animals to go through very specific training onto an airplane, and those same service animals are protected under the Fair Housing Act. But again, there's a differentiation and there's a difference between emotional support animal and a trained service animal. And again, ESAs are allowed in your home. You can request that your housing provider provide a reasonable accommodation, change to rules or policies to allow your ESA into your home if there's a no pet policy. but you cannot bring that same ESA onto an airplane because separate laws. ADA says no, Fair Housing Act says yes, allowed in your house. So just would like to outline that because there was some confusion a few months ago about that. What are reasonable modification requests?
Okay. So if you are a tenant with a disability, you may request a structural change to your unit or to common areas in your building, so even outside of your unit, to allow you the opportunity to fully use and enjoy your housing. So housing providers are required by law to provide reasonable modifications to tenants with disabilities. So again, a reasonable modification is different from an accommodation in the sense that an accommodation is a change to a policy, and a modification is something, more concrete, like installing grab bars in your bathroom so that you can fully access your shower, stuff like that. In terms of who can request a reasonable modification, requests can be made by you, the tenant, or another person acting on your behalf, such as a family member. So it's a very similar process as, the process with requesting an accommodation.
Examples of reasonable modifications include building a ramp to overcome steps at the entrance to a common area, lowering the entry threshold of a unit, installing grab bars in a bathroom, widening the entryways into a bathroom, and providing a flashing doorbell. Do I have to provide documentation or verification of my disability? The same as accommodations, we request that you get a letter from a medical professional or a social worker or other professional. These letters can explain how your modifications are necessary. Of note also, under New York City human rights law, so if you live in the 5 boroughs, your landlord is legally required to pay for the reasonable modification unless they show undue financial or administrative burden. This means that your housing provider, if you are in the 5 boroughs, and this is only in the 5 boroughs because New York State human rights law does not have this coverage. So if you live in Long Island, if you live in any of the 5 surrounding counties, if you live in New York State, your housing provider is not required to pay for your modification, and that the building of your modification and deconstruction and removal of your modification financially falls onto you, which is a very problematic thing given the reality and price of modifications, which we will go into in a bit as well. But if you are in New York City, your housing provider is legally required to provide that modification unless they have undue financial or administrative burden. Undue financial would be, oh my gosh, our roof caved in last year and we actually don't have a budget to provide you with a ramp. An administrative burden would be, we cannot organize this in the building. For instance, we cannot install an elevator into a building that the elevator would cause the building to fall apart. I always think there's room for creative conversations at that point where you say, what about a chairlift? What other modifications can be made so you have full use and enjoyment of your home, which you are allowed to request and deserve under the law. And I realized I just went over the slide we had next. So this slide outlines the same conversation. So again, I really, really want to highlight New York City, your landlord is almost always required to pay. New York State, your landlord is not required to pay. They are not financially responsible. Of note also that I think is important to share is that sometimes when you request a modification, your housing provider may ghost you. Your housing provider may not respond. Your housing provider might just say no. And those are not adequate and okay ways for them to respond under the law. They need to come up with a response. They need to prove undue financial or administrative burden. They cannot just say, nope, we're done, we're not doing it. They need to show you concrete evidence as to why they cannot provide you with the modification or allow it in your home. Because it's possible also outside of New York City, in New York State, that you may request a modification that you would, again, be legally required to pay for and take on the financial obligation, and your housing provider may still say, no, I'm not going to do it. It's going to destroy the building, or it's going to ruin the design. That's not undue administrative burden. Like it can be argued that's not undue administrative burden. There's open room to really push back.
Cookie, leave it.
Okay, so now we're gonna get into really the meat and potatoes of this presentation, the Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Fund.
One moment. What do we do? So the FHCC's Adele Friedman Housing Accessibility Fund, also known as the fund, provides financial assistance to low and moderate income renters with disabilities who require reasonable modifications to their homes.
Okay, so the fund can be used for two purposes. The first is to compensate an expert hired by us, the Fair Housing Justice Center, to evaluate reasonable modification requests and to get a cost estimate. So, if you're looking to install a ramp or something like that, the expert would come in, they would make an assessment, they would do all of the measurements, like all of that good stuff, and provide a cost estimate to the housing provider that could then be used to obtain a better understanding of like, how are we going to pay for it? So the second part of that is the fund can be used to pay qualified contractors for work performed to make the requested modifications. So like in the example that Cass was giving, if a housing provider can't pay for it, then the fund, if you qualify, the fund could be used to pay for that modification.
And I want to quickly outline also, so when these are applied in our office, we oftentimes have assessments provided in New York City. So while your housing provider in New York City is required to provide and pay for, is financially obligated to pay for a reasonable modification, we will often support individuals in the initial assessment due to the fact that their landlords and housing providers have delayed the process, that the process seems hard to tangibly practice, and the verification process may be an issue. So when folks qualify, we can come in and provide an architect who comes and measures, as Noah shared, who does a estimated financial cost, which can help push against the undue financial burden argument. And then for individuals outside of New York City, whose landlords and housing providers are not required to financially provide assistance for their modifications, we can help with both the assessment and the modification. So to qualify for the fund, you have to be a person with a disability or have a person with a disability in your household who is requesting a physical reasonable modification to their dwelling. You should complete the intake process with our office, where we document the needs for the reasonable modification. You have to maintain legal residence in the Fair Housing Justice Center service areas. So we do not represent the entirety of New York State. We represent all 5 boroughs of New York City and the 5 surrounding counties, including Dutchess, Nassau, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Suffolk, and Westchester counties. We do have an income requirement. We request that the individual households have an income which is at or below 165% of the New York State median family income. We don't have the exact number because it changes yearly, but many individuals who reach out do qualify. If you don't qualify, we usually provide additional resources and information that may be helpful to your needs.
Okay, so the fund is not available if you or other members of your household own other real estate that you do not occupy, or if the Fair Housing Justice Center demonstrates that the modification requested is not feasible or reasonable.
The fund also isn't available if you own the property that you're requesting the modification be in. But for instance, if you live in a co-op and the modification you need is in the common area of your building, we can still assist with that. And if you qualify financially, we don't consider that to be part of the occupancy that you own. We've had some cases in the past where an individual has historically owned their home and it's now they have become elders or they have ended up in their lifetime getting a disability and now they require a modification. And due to their disability and their experiences either with aging or the disability that they're navigating, their home was placed into a trust. So while they had historically owned their home, they no longer own it. And we will qualify, those individuals qualify for the fund. We have also, dependent on the circumstances, if there's undue financial burden from a housing provider and many, for instance, if it's an ALP, ACF, or a different form of care, we may, and this is like such a little may, like I can't promise 100%, have sometimes helped modifications in larger units in New York City as well, in the common areas, which sounds very vague, so I apologize for that. How does the Fair Housing Justice Center assist with reasonable modifications? So outside of the fund, we help all individuals, regardless of qualifications that we just outlined. So you can reach out, and if you need an accommodation request or assistance, we can provide assistance. You do not have to qualify for the fund to receive assistance. We can help individuals make a request for a reasonable modification. Let's say they're like, I know exactly the modification I need. I've already outlined it. I know the cost, or I don't need to worry about the cost. It's fine. I just need help making a modification request. We can do that. We can help you write a reasonable modification letter. We can help you write a reasonable accommodation letter. And we can help document the housing provider's response to your request and assist you to exercise your fair housing rights should the request be denied. So this could mean continuing to write letters and responses and keeping a document trail of your communications. It could also mean, if possible, dependent on if we have cooperating attorneys available, providing a legal referral, either to a legal clinic or a lawyer group that can provide assistance regarding reasonable modifications and accommodations. So again, to reiterate, except for the qualifications required in the fund, all of our other services are provided to individuals with disabilities residing in our areas at no charge and with no income requirements. So again, if you need an accommodation help, if you need modification help, that does not include reaching out and using the monetary financial assistance we have in the fund, we can assist you, and we want to assist you. So please feel free to reach out. If you're unsure if you may or may not qualify, reach out. We can always take you through the process. We can always find out if you qualify or if you do not. But again, we have these resources. We want to share. We want to be present. Additionally, oh yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Cass. So we do have some we do have some other additional resources that we highly encourage you to check out. These resources I'll also just plug. They have been translated into Spanish, simplified Chinese. Some of our resources are in Russian. So we hope that it can be as accessible as possible, and we're working every day to make it more accessible. But we do provide additional resources, including our fact sheets. So I'll just highlight a few. We do have a ton of fact sheets on our website. There's a special tab for that you can go to. Fact sheets about, general fair housing rights, all of that kind of stuff if you want to educate yourself beyond what we've learned today about disability. But I'll just highlight that we have some fact sheets on, general fair housing rights for folks with disabilities. We have a fact sheet on reasonable modifications and accommodations. And we also have a really cool fact sheet that is about letters from medical providers to support a tenant's reasonable accommodation or modification request. So this fact sheet literally gives you a template that you can send to your medical provider, just to give them, more information on how to best support you in getting that modification or accommodation request, or just having that kind of like documentation of your disability from a professional. And then the final fact sheet that we'll plug today is a fact sheet on housing discrimination and emotional support animals. So again, great resources on there, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat to our fact sheet page on our website.
I also want to note that while this presentation is disability focused, the Fair Housing Justice Center does not only do disability. We provide resources and support for all covered protected characteristics. So we provide resources for individuals navigating race discrimination, navigating discrimination on the basis of voucher status or source of income. We have a lot of source of income cases. A lot of housing providers are really sticky about their responses to voucher holders. We provide assistance for individuals navigating immigration status discrimination, navigating gender discrimination, navigating really any particular characteristic that we went over in the beginning of the presentation. We can help you navigate the facts, sort through them, see what your options are. Again, this is all based in housing and fair housing, so it could be while you're looking for your rental or looking to buy a house, or while you're living in your apartment or your house. Again, discrimination is existent, and we have the services and support that planned and organized to assist you. So thank you. Please contact us to learn more to report housing discrimination. So again, if you experience any discrimination based on the basis of a protected characteristic, please reach out. If something you experience leaves a weird taste in your mouth, please reach out. A lot of housing discrimination can be really nefarious, really like underground, kind of like feels like you're being gaslit. And we recommend really to just reach out. Like, we have these resources, we want to help, and housing is a really difficult thing to navigate, and no one should experience discrimination and be treated as less than in their already very, very unquestionably difficult housing search.